Mr. Chandran, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for those very warm words of welcome. I am absolutely delighted to be here today and to share at least the first sessions of your proceedings in a way that I know will be a little bit challenging in terms of some of the ideas I'd like to add today. This is my first roundtable, so I appreciate that I still have a huge amount to learn about what's going on. And certainly going to the preparatory clusters, as I was able to do this morning, reminded me yet again of just how challenging and complex this whole area of sustainable palm oil really is. I, if you like, am the first of two bookends, the first keynote speaker, and then on Thursday afternoon, when you have the concluding oration, you will have had 2 days of incredibly rich content looking at every single aspect of what the RSPO is trying to do to advance the cause of sustainable palm oil and the cause of sustainability more generally. It would be impossible for me to try and second guess exactly what it is that those 2 days hold in store for you. And I don't think that would be particularly helpful either. So what I really want to try and do, if I may, is to look in two directions. Firstly, to look back a little and present you with something of a historical perspective on how it is that we've got here today. And secondly, to look forward a little and to suggest what it is that may await us in terms of the next few years, or at least the next decade. That historical perspective is obviously quite a painful one at the moment. I imagine that almost all of you would share the perspective of most people today that the world now finds itself in an extremely troublesome and powerless position. It is an extraordinary moment for humankind. We face a daunting array of converging crises, all of which, in its own right, would prove extremely challenging for governments all around the world. But when you look at the combination of these crises coming together at one point in time, at one point in history, you can see why it is that so many politicians in the world today give the appearance of startled rabbits in the headlights. They are finding it very difficult to make sense of those converging crises. Very difficult to reflect what that means for their electorates. Very difficult to bring it to the attention of those electorates and their people that this probably represents the single most important turning point in the history of humankind since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Now I say that because in essence, these converging crises all have a common cause, can all be tracked back to some of the deep dysfunctionalities in the model of progress that has dominated human affairs over the last few decades. I want to address myself just briefly to two of those common causes, if you like. Firstly, to the financial crisis that we face today, particularly in Western economies, and secondly, to the so-called environmental crisis, which is obviously very much at the front of our minds here at the RSPO gathering. On the financial crisis, I will be as brief as I can be. The origins of that lie deep in a particular model of capitalism about which I think very few people today feel very much pride. It was a model of capitalism which was talked up well beyond its ability to deliver on behalf of humankind, and which has disappointed and, I would argue, betrayed many people who now find themselves confronting an extremely dismal prospect for the next period of their lives. The problem is that that model of progress was offered on the basis that it would be possible to have a permanent expansion in economic activity indefinitely over time with every single person ending up at the end of every year richer than they were at the start of that year. It's a difficult promise to make in a world which is already as troubled as ours is, both from an equity perspective and from an environmental sustainability perspective. It was underpinned, if you like, by an approach to the use of credit which has proved to be extremely dangerous. Credit is a powerful but extremely simple idea. Credit is the ability to consume future resources today at the expense of consumption tomorrow. At the expense of consumption tomorrow as we pay back the debt that we've incurred in the use of that credit. Think of it in terms of the mortgages that many people have taken out only to find that the asset on which that mortgage was based is not worth the amount that they thought it was. Think of it in terms of millions of people all around the world maxing out on their own personal credit. Think of it in terms of far too many governments around the world seeking to narrow the gap between the revenues they derive from taxation and public expenditure by borrowing more and more every year. This has led to, as you know, a massive financial crisis in the Western economies. For us, that party ended in 2008. And pretty much everything that is going wrong in the world today, whether it's to do with the debacle in the Eurozone, with the degree to which the US economy is incapable of rediscovering its former dynamism, whether it's to do with fears for the global economy as a whole, everything goes back to that misuse of credit over a 30 to 40-year period. Now, we're getting used to that. The prospects of having to deal with it are grim for many people. And I'm sure you have read all the stories about what is happening in Europe at the moment. But that is not the only consequence of 4 decades worth of living on the tick, of living on it, as it were, on the prospect of limitless credit. From an environmental point of view, we have also been consuming future resources, future environmental resources, on the assumption that in the future we would be able to go on doing that indefinitely. We've drawn down on our stocks of natural capital at a faster rate than they can possibly regenerate in terms of the world's fisheries, forests, topsoil, fresh water, biodiversity, you name it. We have taken what we can in a smash and grab fashion of that natural capital. Now, perhaps the easiest way of explaining this briefly is to talk in terms of something that NGOs in Europe describe as Earth Overshoot Day. At which point in the year, on which day, do we, the human species, begin to make more use of the Earth's natural resources than it can provide us with? So Earth Overshoot Day is that day in the year when demand on nature's services exceeds renewable supply. Go back 40 years. In 1972, there were no more than 5 days where we were living beyond our environmental means. 1982, a decade onwards, the number had reached about 10 days a year. 1992, about 60 days. 2002, 80 days. And in 2012, it is estimated that it'll be 140 days where we are living in debt. 225 days in environmental credit, still credit worthy, and 140 days in debt. Essentially, we have come to depend on a drawdown of the Earth's resources which cannot possibly be sustained into the future. It is simply not possible to do that. Now, the fact that these two crises, the financial crisis and the environmental crisis, are converging on the same point couldn't possibly be more problematic for humankind. Many of the things that might once have looked like reasonable mitigation measures now look as if they're completely unaffordable. The work of Lester Brown and his colleagues in estimating the total amount of investment which would be required to replenish stocks of natural capital, and he calculated a sum of around $93 billion a year for the next decade to restore the natural capital that we have so seriously depleted, much of that expenditure is now judged to be completely unaffordable. Now, I'm sure that you will all understand that this is not a particularly difficult problem to fathom out. We've had a combination of things going on which have been extraordinarily dynamic and exciting from one perspective, but deeply problematic from another. Underpinning it is, of course, the huge surge in human numbers between 1950 and today. In 1950, world population amounted to no more than 3 billion people. Today, we are now at 7 billion people. And by 2050, we will almost certainly have gone through the 9 billion mark. That is an extraordinary growth in numbers of human beings seeking to improve their lives on this planet. And of course, at the same time, happily, for hundreds of millions of people, life has got a great deal better from an economic point of view. But politicians are finding this now very difficult to deal with. As I said, they look paralyzed, even as the warnings become more strident about our failure to address this sustainability crunch moment. And these warnings don't just come from the usual suspects, as I'm sure that many of you would describe them, the environmental organizations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but they come increasingly from organizations